The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, her faded blue uniform hanging loose on her small frame. 3 teenagers near the energy drinks snickered, one pointing at the generic name tag that simply read Sarah in crooked letters. "Look at that uniform," the tallest one whispered, loud enough for her to hear. "And looks like she got it from a thrift store dumpster." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes down, continuing her methodical cleaning. She'd heard it all before in this cramped Washington D.C. convenience store. Comments about her worn clothes, her quiet demeanor, the way she seemed to fade into the background. What they didn't know was that some uniforms tell stories their wearers can never speak aloud. What they couldn't see was the small, carefully hidden patch sewn into the inner lining of her collar, a patch that belonged to a unit that officially never existed. The morning rush brought its usual parade of government workers grabbing coffee and pastries before heading to their offices, scattered throughout the capital. Sarah moved efficiently behind the register, her movements precise and economical in a way that suggested military training to anyone who knew what to look for. But nobody looked closely at the middle-aged woman in the discount uniform. A businessman in an expensive suit rolled his eyes when she fumbled with the cash register, muttering something about hiring standards. A woman in designer heels clicked her tongue impatiently as Sarah bagged her items, clearly viewing her as nothing more than part of the urban furniture. The security camera in the corner captured it all, every dismissive glance, every condescending smile. But what the camera couldn't capture was the way Sarah's eyes swept the store in calculated patterns, or how her hand instinctively moved to her hip whenever the door chime rang, reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. The bell above the door chimed at 10:47 a.m., and Sarah glanced up to see a man in a dark suit enter. He moved differently than the usual customers, his eyes scanning the interior with professional thoroughness before settling on her face. Something flickered in his expression, a moment of recognition that he quickly suppressed. Sarah's hand paused on the inventory clipboard, her pulse quickening for reasons she couldn't quite name. The man approached the counter with deliberate steps, his bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes. "Pack of Marlboros," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed out of place in the fluorescent-lit store. But it wasn't his voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the way his eyes lingered on her face, studying features he seemed to know from somewhere else, somewhere far from this mundane world of energy drinks and lottery tickets. The teenagers were still there, now openly laughing at something on one of their phones, occasionally glancing her way with poorly concealed amusement. Sarah handed the suited man his cigarettes, their fingers briefly touching as he took them. His skin was rough, calloused in ways that spoke of weapons training and field work. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her face remaining neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "I don't think so," she replied. But even as she spoke, fragments of memory began surfacing. A briefing room in Langley, night operations in Kandahar, a voice giving orders through an encrypted radio. This man wasn't just military, he was agency. And if he was here asking questions, it meant her carefully constructed new life was about to crumble. The question wasn't whether he recognized her. The question was what he planned to do about it. The suited man stepped back from the counter but didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking in hushed tones while keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah. The teenagers had moved closer, one of them now recording video with his phone, apparently planning to mock the pathetic store clerk for their social media followers. Sarah could hear fragments of the man's conversation. Positive identification, thought she was... Her hands began to shake slightly as she pretended to organize the cigarette display. 23 years. 23 years since she disappeared from official records, since her unit had been dissolved and its members scattered to the wind. 23 years of living as a ghost, working menial jobs, staying invisible. The man ended his call and turned back to her, his expression now deadly serious. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. The teenagers fell silent, sensing something had changed in the atmosphere of the small store. Sarah's training told her to deny everything, to maintain her cover at all costs. But the way this man said her real name, with a mixture of respect and something approaching awe, told her that denial would be pointless. "I go by Sarah Johnson now," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. The man nodded slowly, then did something that made her heart stop. He straightened to attention and brought his right hand up in a crisp military salute. Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the small store. The teenagers' phones captured it all. The mysterious suited man saluting the woman they'd been mocking moments before. The convenience store that had been filled with casual chatter fell completely silent. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, her mind racing through possibilities and protocols. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to stay hidden, forgotten, officially dead. But here stood a CIA officer, saluting her in broad daylight, in front of witnesses with cameras. Her cover wasn't just blown, it was obliterated. The man held the salute until Sarah, operating on instincts, buried but never forgotten, straightened her shoulders and returned it. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from a lifetime ago when she wore a different kind of uniform. The teenagers lowered their phones, confusion replacing their earlier amusement. "Yeah, holy shit," one whispered, the profanity hanging in the air like smoke. The suited man lowered his hand and leaned across the counter. "Deputy Director Harrison sends his regards, Ghost," he said, using a call sign that made Sarah's knees nearly buckle. Ghost, the name she'd carried through 12 black operations across 4 continents. The name attached to classified files that would never see daylight. The name of someone who was supposed to be dead. "We need to talk," the man continued. "There's been a development." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If they were breaking protocol to contact her, it meant something big was happening, something that required the skills of someone who officially didn't exist. The next few minutes passed in a blur of barely controlled chaos. The teenagers, now realizing they'd witnessed something far beyond their understanding, began posting their videos online with captions full of speculation and conspiracy theories. The suited man, who introduced himself only as Agent Torres, waited patiently as Sarah processed the situation. Her handler from the old days had promised her a quiet retirement, a chance to disappear completely, but promises made in the world of black operations were written in invisible ink. "The Prometheus Protocol," Torres said quietly, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew that name. It was connected to her last operation, the one that had officially killed her and scattered her unit. The one that was supposed to be buried so deep that even thinking about it required security clearance levels that didn't appear on any public chart. "I thought that was terminated," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the store's humming freezers. Torres shook his head grimly. "Prometheus was never terminated, it was transferred, and now it's active again." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Prometheus had been a deep-cover infiltration program designed to place assets so deep within enemy organizations that even their handlers would lose track of them. She had been one of 12 operatives trained for the program, each given a different legend, a different life to disappear into. But the program had been deemed too dangerous, too likely to create operatives who could never be recalled or controlled. The official story was that it had been shut down and all assets recalled. The unofficial truth, apparently, was very different. "How many others?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "That's classified," Torres replied, but his expression told her everything she needed to know. Not many, maybe none. The store's security camera continued recording, capturing a conversation that could rewrite intelligence history. Outside, Washington D.C. continued its daily routine, unaware that a ghost had just been resurrected. The teenagers had finally left. their phones full of footage they couldn't possibly understand, spreading across social media platforms where intelligence analysts were already working to suppress and discredit the content. Torres glanced around the empty store, ensuring they were alone. "The deputy director wants to reactivate you," he said. "Full reinstatement, back pay for 23 years, and a new identity with complete protection." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "And if I refuse?" Torres's expression didn't change. "Then you continue being Sarah Johnson, convenience store clerk, until something unfortunate happens to you." The threat was delivered matter-of-factly, without malice. It was simply the reality of her situation. Once you knew certain secrets, the only way out was through. "What's the mission?" she asked, already knowing she had no real choice. "There's a mole in the agency," Torres replied. "Someone with access to Prometheus files. Someone who's been feeding information to hostile foreign services for at least 5 years. We need someone they won't suspect. Someone who's been off the grid long enough to be beyond suspicion. Someone like a dead woman working in a convenience store." Sarah looked around the store that had been her world for the past 3 years. The faded promotional posters, the scratched linoleum, the cash register that required percussive maintenance to function properly. It had been a kind of purgatory, but it had been hers. Safe, invisible, normal. Torres watched her internal struggle with professional patience. "You have 6 hours to decide," he said, pulling a card from his jacket. "But Sarah, the people who are hunting Prometheus assets aren't going to stop just because you're working at a 7-Eleven. The card bore only a phone number and a time 5 p.m. "Call the number. Someone will guide you through the next steps." He turned to leave, then paused. "Well, for what it's worth, you were the best operative the program ever produced. The Ghost was a legend, even among people who trade in legends." With that, he walked out, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of a decision that wasn't really a decision at all. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, unaware that one of its most unremarkable citizens had just been offered a chance to become extraordinary again. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah went through the motions of her job, checking inventory, restocking shelves, serving customers who had no idea they were being waited on by someone who had once infiltrated a terrorist cell in Chechnya. But her mind was elsewhere, weighing options and calculating risks. At 4:47 p.m., she locked the store's front door and walked to the small office in the back. The phone card Torres had given her felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her pocket. She dialed the number with steady fingers despite everything. A voice answered on the first ring. "Ghost," it said. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "I'm in," Sarah replied, the words coming out before her conscious mind had fully processed the decision. "Transportation will arrive at your residence at 600 hours, the voice said. "Bring nothing, everything will be provided." The line went dead. Sarah sat in the cramped office, surrounded by receipts and inventory sheets, and realized she was smiling for the first time in years. The Ghost was coming back from the dead, and someone was about to learn why that name had once been whispered in intelligence circles around the world.